So
think,
wait, what do you
or
want to do with this? You want to have like a separate section on this and upload it, or you want to add it to the existing videos, or what do you want to do with this?
so well, this will be the Master Debaters Corner, just missing your insights. So this will be a standalone episode whenever we can't have you for catch up.
Damn,
Um,
I feel honored. But okay, let's
well,
go. Hit
yeah,
me with the
let's go.
questions.
Well, I mean, I'm just gonna go topic by topic. I didn't prepare. I just have the topics we talked about, and let me just get your insights. We'll just keep it a loose, casual conversation. Keep it easy.
Perfect.
Breeze through it. Oh my God! Look at this guy.
There we go. It's a little bit muddy, yeah? Is
Well,
that better?
are you just using your computer camera?
Yes.
That's fine.
Yes. I have a MacBook, so my camera has significantly improved now.
Oh wow! Is that a company laptop?
That's
The one
right.
that you don't have a job with?
You know, the funny thing was, I spent the last 4 months not using it. And then this week we were meeting face to face, and it's against company policy to be using your personal laptop. So,
Oh
so I had
wow!
to activate the Mac while in these
Ah,
meetings and
oh, that's
pretend I
hilarious.
was actually working on shit. And it was like, and it was like downloading Mac OS Monterey 3 hours. I was like, fuck, how do I screen share?
Jesus. Oh man, that sounds like you're very deep into the fintech business now, huh?
Yeah, it's good. It's good. I mean, the balance is great, man. But the balance was great when I was in LATAM. Now that I'm here in London, I just
Of
realized like,
course. They tricked you, dude. That's how it works.
no, but I'll move back to that time zone, dude. Like that time zone was great. 20 hours a week, and then like I'm staying in London now in a place that's the size of
Yeah,
Harry Potter's.
shoebox.
Like, yeah, it's a
Yeah.
shoebox. And it's double the price of my two-bedroom apartment in Mexico City.
Yeah, London, Hong Kong, you live like a modified student unless you're making over 400K a year, right? So that's how
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah. I don't think it ever makes sense to live here, yo. Gotta head back to
It,
Mexico City.
it does if you live a very simple life or if you have a lot of money, right? It's either or.
Yeah, but even if you have a lot of money, like it feels like wasteful. Like, do you know what I mean? Like I don't know.
Well, it's literally a financial city, so you know how those people are. So
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
yeah. Otherwise, you're doing well. You're looking healthy. London making you a little fair, or is it just the light?
It's the lighting. Actually, I should face the light, but this place is positioned in a really shitty way. Let's see if I can do this. I'm not wearing pants though,
No,
so we gotta position this in such a way that you don't see my underwear, especially
I'm pretty
since it's,
sure we could work that out. That's like we only see it if you really want us to see it, Andrew. So that's on you.
hey, it's to get your viewership up, yo.
Yeah.
You
So
know,
so is it true? Are you coming back to KL? Is this for real or?
the rumors are true. London was
Yeah.
a perfect stopover. So like basically, I knew I had to come back for Q1
Yeah.
to London, and since like they're paying for my flights, it just makes sense to just use this.
Yeah, might as well. Yeah, you cut more
Might as well.
costs.
So like they'll
Yeah.
they'll cover my Mexico, London, and then now London to Malaysia. So free trip back home.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
what exactly are you doing? Are you still doing expansion for them? Growth? What is it?
Um. So I explained to you, right? I run a team called Explore, and Explore is basically like we have a weekly process where I work with the founders to come up with the highest constraints problems. Like so, basically every week we define what is the biggest constraint the business has, and then we split it up. It's like, and then we use a methodology that's very similar to Agile. So the constraint gets broken down into smaller problems. The small problems then get broken down into teams. The teams figure out how to fix that problem, and then I
I,
just
I
make the
think
yeah.
I think you just merged your two previous careers together into a current job, essentially. I see what you did there. Very
That's
good though.
right.
To be fair though, like that's actually valuable. Like when you try to hire people to do that, like actual thinking, it's at scale. You're just so tunnel vision. You need someone like who's like outside to help you do that. So I could see that. Makes sense.
I definitely feel like I'm adding value. And the cool thing is like, I started with a team of four, and now like we've built a system where like 20 people in the organization get into this meeting once a week,
Nice.
and
Very
and we
nice.
have like multiple constraints, right? So like, like so they have a set of OKRs that are core OKRs, and then we have like exploratory OKRs where we don't know the
Yeah.
answer, And so these OKRs start with know how to do X, like know how to launch affiliate marketing, know how to launch the US, know how to launch instant revenues as a conversion tactic for
Yeah.
lending, right? And then like it's three people working together in these sub projects, and then they report weekly on it, and we come up with new constraints. So it's very like it's an organic way to just keep like motion and innovation
It
happening.
it almost sounds like some sort of form of a growth team
It's
specifically,
exactly that.
right?
It's
Yeah.
growth meets strategy meets
Yeah.
product in like a very hacky way of doing it, using Kanban, moving cards down. You know,
Yeah.
like basically, I'm working with the CPO who's coaching me on like product, all these different product techniques, and then I'm
Nice.
merging the
Very
stuff he's
nice.
teaching me with what I know from BCG, using like hypothesis validation, experimentation,
Yeah.
and then like reading a ton of books about what's the minimum experiment you need to run to prove disprove something,
Yeah.
right? So basically, like when there's a problem and we don't know the answer, how can you set an experiment within 3 or 4 days? That's the minimum
Mm.
viable experiment you need to test to prove or invalidate the first point you need to
Can
prove. Yeah.
can you give us context about what the nature of the company is? How big are the people? Like, what stage are you at? Because this only kind of makes sense for typically really big companies who have a lot of volume where, data points are large enough to be meaningful in sample size, right? Otherwise, I can't even imagine like an early stage startup doing this, and unless you do like maybe one or two experiments, in
No,
your
not
first
true, not
year,
true.
or
So for example, like um so what they have, the unit economics are working really well for them. But the product is heavily commoditized, and a lot of like larger players have the potential to launch this product almost immediately, right? So if you have infra, you can add lending and figure out the credit scoring model relatively quickly between like 6 to 9 months, and they know that. So they know
what is
that the
this business doing?
so
What are
they
they
do
doing?
revenue based financing. That's their main
Okay,
product,
revenue based
right?
funds. Okay.
But they know that they can launch alternate lending products, and they know that they can provide so they found themselves in a few interesting scenarios. In scenario number one is they have a product, the unit economics are fantastic. Scenario number two is they somehow seem to be lending mostly to digital e-commerce businesses primarily instead of SaaS businesses, as which most RBF tends to do SaaS, right?
Well, I mean, it's technically less risky, right? But I mean, I think that's probably what people have found out. But I feel e-commerce, with certain margins and certain categories, could do really well, right? Like the cash flow should be very predictable, and you should know when it's coming back.
Correct, correct. But the problem is like if somebody enters that market and undercuts price, you'll just get fucked, right?
That's true. Yeah, that's
So,
true. That's
so
true.
for them, they're just like panicking about that, and they're like, okay, we need to build either a moat around infrastructure, or a moat around like alternate lending products, or a moat around like new geographies and like speed of expansion. And
Wow. Okay.
hey, I like
Why not just focus on what was working, or is it not defensible?
not defensible.
Okay, that's fair. So, but I mean, like what we've been seeing, and we're still actually seeing this. I'm seeing that like the headlines, like people are raising like 700, $800 million still. Like people are, and I think they're probably in the same position that your company's probably at. Like, so it sounds like they're trying to focus on a quote unquote healthier approach, at least a more sustainable approach, right? So at least
So
it's like less
they've got
existential.
like two major investors that are very like fuck growth, keep your book healthy, which is like very weird.
It's very anti Silicon Valley. Is it like a London thing, or what's going
I
on?
no, it's like it's old school lending, like
Ah,
so okay. The way it
makes
works,
sense.
actually, the business and the insight that was like the most interesting for me is they actually don't have any loans on their books. What happens is, it's like it's like um it's like lending. What imagine this, right? What they do is they borrow an apartment block and then they
Yeah.
Airbnb manage the rooms.
Oh, okay. So it's like a layer, but that means they're using someone else's assets.
Correct, correct. And those guys that lend them the apartment block are like, "Fuck you, you ain't growing this high. You need to make sure the rooms like
Oh, I
don't get
see.
rock
So it's
stars
very,
and shit."
but it's like a form of platform risk too, though. No, like how are their interests aligned? They have what they invested equity, or what is it?
No, they give them debt. They give them debt at a certain cost of capital. The cost of
Oh,
capital
okay,
has
I
certain
see.
requirements on it, and then you
Oh,
need
that's
to hold
aligned.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah. So the truth is, you can
makes
run this
sense.
business with very little equity. You don't need to fundraise. It's fucking amazing, man. The unit economics.
it makes sense in London because I feel like bulge bracket banks have a lot of underutilized infra and assets that they're
It's not
trying
just
to
bulge bracket.
monetize.
Like the guys who lend to them, I'm just learning about all this in the last 2 months, right? Are people that have like hundreds of billions of just pure debt. They don't even
I-
have equity.
Institutional debt
It's
money.
institutional debt
Okay.
lenders, correct? And then for them, these
Yeah.
guys are like, "Oh, what? You want 100 million? Yeah, here you go." Right? So
That's
they don't even.
fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. So you
What
could
I think there's
theoretically run this
go
business
ahead.
without raising equity.
Yeah. Well, I saw recently an article for 2022 to date, largest asset flows to asset classes. Largest obviously still is hedge funds. It's like 20 something percent, close to 30%. And then half of that was like VC, and half of, which is like roughly half of a quarter, right? The other half of a quarter was private equity. So combined, it's all like half of the pie was just private equity. But then
Yeah.
a small slice was only debt, funds raising for debt, which means there must be a big opportunity for tech to get to
The
there.
recycling is very high.
Yeah.
They just like keep it flowing, and like most people don't want
Mm.
to. I don't know. It may grow now that the recession is coming, right?
Yeah. I mean, well, if interest rates peak up, right, then risk
The yield curve
off.
is reversing, bro. It's
There's-
inevitable. We've never had a false positive. This could be the first, but
Uh, well, it's delays and then maybe flattens out a bit, and then, but I mean,
no.
yeah, once it inverts,
Gas price
it's
going
usually
up. You got a war in Ukraine. China's
okay.
been doing stuff to our movie.
Perfect segue. So we got to get your viewpoint on this. Like, I don't know if you were to follow the previous episodes. If not, I could briefly update you. But the first topic we did talk about was Russia, Ukraine. So I mean, we're well into it. This is already at the month mark,
Yeah.
and based off the headlines, it seems like both sides are really strained. Like the headlines are there's no more of this like one-sided narrative propaganda. Zelensky is really feeling pressured with the amount of brutality and destruction coming down from Russia. Russia seems like their resources are really getting pushed to the limit too. So I think it seems like it's almost coming to a natural resolution. But what do you think? What are there any different insights that you have or
Yeah, so
conversations
I
you've been
mean,
talking
okay,
about?
let's just first gather that. I think generally what the media likes to do in a lot of these types of instances is they take the underdog, right? We saw that in Crimea. We saw that in, honestly, with every major like battlefront in the last like 10, 20 years,
Yeah.
the media always tries to paint a picture that the underdog is winning. The truth
Mhm.
is, Russia has a much stronger military might, and the complexities when you come like, sure, Ukraine has the support of NATO in terms of intelligence, in terms of arms, in terms of like the military aid that they're supporting them with, but it's a very one-sided war, right? And Russia hasn't put their full might behind this yet. It's literally like supposed to be fast and quick. That's where they're getting screwed over. But one
Yeah.
thing is very clear though: Putin does not care about international sanctions or international perspectives on
Mhm.
Russia at the moment. There's no like political hearts and minds war at the moment
Yeah.
coming from Russia at all, which means like it's a very different kind of war. Like he's willing to do anything. They I don't know if the rumors are right. They're using white phosphorus last week, right? And like
Mhm.
white phosphorus is it's a banned chemical to be used in
Yeah.
any sort of war circumstance, but they're
Yeah.
using it in Ukraine. And if they are using it in Ukraine and with no retaliation, it means like Russia really, really doesn't care about any sort of action from the EU. Um, what I think is going to happen is there will be it may be prolonged. I won't put my money on it, but it's hard to see Russia backing out of this, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to see Russia backing out of this. They're gonna go through with it and try to push through. um, um, and it's working in their favor as well, right? Because they're still selling gas and they're still selling oil, and
Yeah.
they're selling gas and oil to China, to India, to Germany still. And gas prices are going up, which means like this war
Yeah.
is making them money, right?
Yeah.
The
Correct.
sanctions are not affecting them. Like, yes, they are in the short term. The ruble's dropping. Oligarchs can't get their money out. Some oligarch can't pay for his, child's bar bill in London, which is a
Yeah.
terrible thing. I'm pretty sure he has to deal with that pain. Like, can you imagine Putin dealing with 30 people calling him every day, going like, "Hey, bro,
Yeah.
please, can you unlock this stuff so that my
Yeah.
kids don't call me every day?"
Yeah.
But other than that, I think. I think we're seeing now a very belligerent Russia, and the crazy stuff is it's also going to increase belligerency in other parts of the world, right? I think China's going to realize what they can do with Taiwan right now, unhindered.
Well, that's interesting. This narrative almost, I feel, is what would it like what a few people on the circuit were talking about maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago, right? And what's maybe give me your insights on what about to say, but um, the view now is that, at least from what I mean, mine's few days, a little bit older too, because I was researching this midweek, but it's almost like a stalemate, right? Because what's happening is Russia. Well, hold on, let me get this straight. Hold on. So, it's very convoluted, this this topic. Um, so what you're saying is that, yeah, I used to think the same thing, that Russia probably had all the resources, but what one clear narrative is that Russia really didn't have it organized together, and I think a lot of experts, not like propaganda, actual experts who actually study war, are confirming this, right? So that's the first part. Secondly, even if they are able to physically take over, Kiev, and hold, they're able to dominate every single battle, they're not going to be able to hold it long term. So it's a strategic loss in the long term, right? So what happens is, Ukraine is primarily a very low dense population city, and they haven't really successfully taken any major cities yet, right? And even if they are able to take these cities, what happens is these, you essentially make terrorists who will move to the mountains and the forests to fight guerrilla warfare long term, right? It just becomes a protracted war that probably Russia really cannot keep up with. Um, the one thing I really don't really agree with the narrative there was, they were saying that Russia had no plan about what to do once they take over the capital. But I think, they just need to declare, they demilitarize Ukraine, which is a very loose definition, right? They can claim that, they got rid of the Nazis once they take over the city. And they just need a promise of not to join NATO, right? And that's what Moldova has. And then basically, the Moldova says they'll never join NATO, but they're allowed to economically integrate with the West, right? So I think there is room for a clear win for Russia, right? But I don't think they could hold it long term if they want to keep fighting. That's not going to really work, because the people don't really want this,
So not
I
an
don't know.
expert here, but like, in general, there have been pro-Russian movements within Ukraine itself, right? So if you think
Yeah,
about what
for
happened
sure.
after Euromaidan in 2014, right? After the protests, so there was a pro-Russian president in power in Ukraine who, followed Russia's stance and declined Ukraine's membership into the EU. And then you had the Euromaidan revolution, where people were like, no, we actually do want to be a part of the EU,
Yeah,
and threw him out of power, right? But if you look at the referendums, like statistics, it wasn't like overwhelming support. Yes, there was a large amount of support, but
yeah,
if you look at the split between rural, urban, there's actually a
yeah,
big
correct.
amount of people that actually like feel like they should be part of Russia. Now, that sentiment would have changed tremendously, especially with the war of heart and
Oh yeah, for
spine now,
sure.
and
Yeah,
like
yeah,
people knowing at least like one person who's been severely injured or who has lost their home or is having to move to a new country, and like the
yeah,
feeling of being in war is going to change your perspective.
for sure.
So the question is, can they still have that support from that grassroots population
Interesting.
post the war, right? Arguably, no, but you have to think in longer terms, right? These countries like Russia and China think not in the terms of like 1 or 2 term elections,
Yeah,
they think in terms of 15, 20 years, right?
true.
And like, and ultimately it's about economic integration, it's about other kinds of things that you do to benefit that country, right? If you think about
Yeah,
the progress that Germany and Germany and Japan made post World War II, like how
yeah,
many Japanese have anti-American sentiments today? And yet,
yeah.
how many cities did America wipe out with atomic bombs? Right?
Well, that generation is completely gone, right? So they,
Yes, but
I,
it's like, yeah, but it took, I mean, to be honest, one generation later, everyone was wearing jeans and watching television with American commercials, right? So it doesn't take too long to shift mental perspectives. I mean,
that's
in the
true.
grander
Yeah,
scheme of things. So I do think in the short term, managing Ukraine will be hard, but putting a puppet government in place, making sure elections don't happen, making sure you restrict freedoms in such a way that it favors the political agenda that you have in
mm,
place. These are things that you can do very gradually. Like think about Israel Palestine, right? It's
yeah,
hard to be Palestinian and have Palestinian views because your kids won't be able to go to school. You
yeah,
can't get a house. Your son can't get a job, and like these things you need to do to live, right?
yeah,
And like at some point you're like, screw this, I want my kids to go to school, And so if I want them to go to school, I need them to do X. And now you have Palestinians sending their kids for national service to the
Yeah.
IDF, you know? So it's like economic incentives will make people align. Most people aren't very politically motivated. They actually are thinking about how do I get bread on the table and make sure my
Yeah.
children have a better life. And if you make those incentives align, you can get control over a population. It's not going to be easy and it's not
Yeah.
going to be pleasant, but it's possible. It has been done before by countless other countries that are smaller than Russia.
Well, okay. So essentially, if I'm to summarize concisely, you believe that this is going to end up in a Russia win with control, and eventually it will just pass, right?
I mean,
Probabilistically, yeah,
predictions, right? Like any of us can
yeah,
predict anything right now. As a betting person, I would say, and I know it's terrible to say that because I like in my
of
heart's
course,
like there's people who are suffering from this war, right? But
yeah,
I think there's very strong indications that Russia has what it takes to win this war.
interesting,
And I think they have like strong indications to be able to control the territory post the war.
yeah,
Um, that being said, anything can happen. But I do think like the odds of the opposite happening are
yeah.
lower than what I'm predicting.
Yeah. I mean, that's very interesting because that's very anti sentiment of what is being said in the headlines in the past few days, right? So I think it's a very interesting perspective. But if you think that is true, what are the implications with the West? And because at the same time, this could not drag in longer because this really antagonizes people like countries like Poland and other border countries. They're like thinking like, well, if we're next, what are we going to do? And it has forced a lot of change, in the Western hemisphere of Europe where everyone's ramping up now arms and then this it's like they really can't afford, so it has to be much quicker, I think. But at the
Yeah.
same time, then if Russia does end up physically taking over, and let's just say for argument's sake they are able to get a puppet government and suppress, what are the implications? What does that mean for the West then?
So I think NATO has actually become stronger as a result of this, right?
Yeah,
Um, if you think about So actually, one thing that people don't recognize, one of the reasons why Ukraine is doing so well is because they were
yeah,
trained by NATO and they use like they aren't they're using military equipment supplied by NATO. The only reason like one of the many reasons that they haven't been able to join also is because they don't follow like NATO standards in terms of, so I don't know if you know this, but to join NATO, the arms from one country has to be utilizable by another country, right? Which means
interesting,
like the artillery shells you have to be able to fit
yeah,
within artillery equipment. You can't use equipment from outside, right?
mm,
And so like Ukraine doesn't follow a lot of those standards at the moment. But what you can see right now is that in terms of training, that in terms of like the equipment that they're getting and being able to use, like they're doing pretty well with that stuff, right?
yeah,
Which makes it seem that the other countries who are already part of NATO, like Poland, would be ridiculously better prepared. And just for a
sure,
sense of scale to like our listeners who are mostly in Asia, right? Poland's GDP per capita is very similar to Malaysia. Like in terms of like
mm,
their total
yeah,
development, where they are
yeah,
as a country, Eastern Europe resembles Southeast Asia a lot, right? In terms of
yeah,
population, in terms of like
that's true,
culture, a growing middle class. And so these are countries that are like the Thailands and Malaysias of Europe, and they're armed to the teeth with training militaristically in a way that we don't even understand in Asia, right?
yeah,
Now, what's going to happen, my predictions are the countries who were refraining from joining NATO in the past may potentially join them. There's talks
interesting,
of Finland approaching
yes,
NATO right
correct,
now and possibly joining. Could they follow through? I don't know. There's still a very strong pacifist movement within Finland that would reject this, and also it's not a very big country, but one of the closest neighbors to Russia, right?
yeah,
Finland
right,
joining Russia, and in the same way, there's this narrative of Ukraine being a part of Russia in the past. Like I think Finland also would share very like Russians also have this narrative that Finland was once part of Russia, and so that would be like a big blow to
mm,
to Russia. I think you're going to have the 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 possibility of more missiles being aimed at Russia very high.
yeah,
Um, you know, um, in fact, like this whole situation like resembles a lot the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So if you think about
yeah,
it, when Russia was trying to put missiles in Cuba, the U.S. reacted in the way that they did,
oh yeah,
and yet we now have this narrative that it's okay for the U.S. to do that in Ukraine, which is right next to Russia, right?
yeah,
Um, I'm not saying that Russia is right in this. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm just saying that the narratives are
There's
a lot
logic
more.
to it.
There's logic to it. It's not like this is a bad guy who just wants to kill people, which is how the media seems to be playing this, right? I was on the train
Yeah.
yesterday, the tube, and overhearing conversations between people where,
Interesting.
Putin's like Lex Luthor, and he's like just trying to kill innocent people,
That's
and
yeah.
yeah,
That's the strength of Western propaganda, right?
it is. It's powerful, but the truth is,
It's
it's
very
like,
powerful.
man, like if you have a fundamental belief that this other country was a part of yours, historically, and it's a false narrative, but it's a narrative that most of your people believe in. If you have a narrative that, as recent as 30 years ago, this country was a part of yours, which is true, they were part of the USSR. If you have a narrative that promises made to a mega country that used to be part of, the USSR, of
Yeah.
which you are the largest national entity, continue to carry through to you. Remember, NATO did promise the USSR that they would not expand eastwards. Now,
Yeah.
obviously, NATO says that was a promise made to USSR. USSR doesn't exist anymore. Russia does not equal USSR. Russia doesn't believe that.
Yeah. Right.
They believe Russia
Of
equals
course not.
USSR. Correct.
Yeah.
Now, if you hold these three things to be true, and then you have nuclear arms being placed in the closest possible border to them, you
Yeah.
technically have antagonized a bear, right?
You're threatening their way of life, essentially. Well, Putin's version of the way of life, which is, I think a lot of people actually, prescribe to that. They're big
Correct.
supporters of Putin's across Russia, right?
And
So
I truly believe that most Russians believe that in Donbass that there is a genocide happening, and they see themselves as defenders of the Russian way of life in their small territories, and um, like I think they fundamentally believe in these truths, and so it's a question of like one truth versus another, and what's the right move. Obviously, what they're doing is terrible, but it's not illogical.
yeah. Well, let's also say, just so people don't get the wrong sentiment, is that there are also opposite beliefs of what you just said, right? There are leakages of people in Russia who don't support it, obviously, which is, of course, Western propaganda highly pushes those videos out of the protesters getting arrested and whatnot. But there are people like that. I was watching an Asian boss interview on the ground in China, which so I don't know how they kind of got these interviews done. Like I don't know if they submitted to the CCP and the CCP approved it just to be safe, or maybe they just uploaded it somewhere else. But they were interviewing people in Shanghai on the views of the war, and majority of the people just wanted peace. Of course, there's this one guy who basically said what you said. Very like big supporter of Putin. He felt like they were just defending themselves, this kind of thing. But it just shows that there are multiple beliefs in the country. It's just
Yeah,
not one monolithic
I
idea.
100% agree. And
Yeah,
what's interesting is like every Russian person I met in Latin America during my travels there would be what we consider to be liberals, right?
yeah,
Who are against the war, who don't believe that this is the
yeah,
right thing for their country to do, and
yeah,
there's a strong amount of like support. But my belief is that they're mostly Western educated, English speaking, generally richer, upper middle class,
mm,
right?
yeah.
And so
Bubble.
and also when you're in a country where that kind of thought is going to be heavily restricted, super difficult for you to be able to voice that out, right? It's not like
True.
they're treating protesters very well in that country.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Well,
Um,
my last question for this topic then is: do you think this leads more towards a Cold War 2.0, or this has a possibility of an accidental World War 3?
Man, predictions, even though I'm trained as a financial engineer and run predictive models, I can tell you with most predictive models it's all bullshit,
All out the
right? You have
window.
some
Yeah.
assumptions, some of those assumptions even like exponentially scale to infinity, so there's no way you build these models out really well, right?
Yeah.
um I am an optimist at heart. I think countries aren't that stupid. At least I like to believe. Um, so, post the 70s, what we saw is a tremendous growth in global trade, which gave us the biggest period of global peace we've had. Yes, we've had tiny skirmishes, we've had some large scale wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, for example, but this
Yeah.
generally did not affect global trade, right?
Yeah.
I
Right.
think I think there's a big understanding in a pact, not very contractual, between countries, that trade creates prosperity, prosperity creates peace. And breaking that pact, it generates a massive amount of breakage, right? And the
Yeah.
countries that are the most likely to lose from this are the countries that have the most to gain from it right now, i.e., the Russias,
China.
the Indias, the Chinas of the world. right?
Yeah.
Who are still at that early stage of growth, who are growing their
Yeah.
companies like
Correct.
massive, the countries like massive corporations. So
Yep.
my firm belief, obviously I could be wrong, I'm not a military expert, is that prosperity is more important than um,
Yeah.
the I mean, sovereignty is important, right? So a loss of
Yeah.
sovereignty will cause a risk in prosperity. But right now, sovereignty isn't being threatened yet, right? What's
Well,
being
it's yeah. So go
yeah
ahead. Finish that thought.
no what's being threatened is sovereignty in these like third party countries that aren't a part of the
Ah,
major,
okay. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so as a result, I don't think until sovereignty is threatened, prosperity will take precedence.
Yeah, it almost seems you and Jangan are very similar. I mean, by in terms of pragmatism, Jangan thinks more of the power geopolitical dynamics of outcomes, and then but yours more is like if the powers that be, the incentives, right? If you look at incentives, which is a powerful kind of mental model to use here, like what are the people who are in power? What incentives do they have? Of course, would be towards peace, right? If they break certain social contracts, we're going to live in a very different world where
Yeah,
that it's going to be a lot more friction, more inflationary,
yeah.
if it's decoupled, right? Then it's just not efficient kind of markets and growth going forward.
But
It's just
also
very weird.
survival, man. Like if you threaten the likelihood of your country surviving, you lose your own survival mechanism, right? Like if
Yeah,
Putin loses gas revenues and the ruble
correct.
collapses even further, he basically threatens his own possible legacy.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
All right, so why don't we move on to the next topic since
perfect. Hey, I
this
have
this
like
is a very
10 minutes, but we did 20 minutes for Russia. Can we?
no worries.
What else do you have on the plate?
Lazada spin out.
Lazada's IPO.
Yeah, they were supposed to IPO, but then they paused it, right? So we could talk about Uh, I don't know if you know. I don't know if you know anything about SCB investing Akulaku. You probably know about Akulaku, right?
Yeah.
Then there's also Didi and the Chinese tech stocks, which is very sad, I'm sure, for everyone's portfolio. Goto IPO and then a Grab and SCA results. So I don't know what you want to talk about.
Man, I feel like all these news is from 3 weeks ago, and my updates are going to come super late. Are you sure there's value in this master debater session? Even my
Sure.
perspective. Yeah.
Well, the Lazada one I think is useful because you have a unique insider perspective, possibly, or you have people who are still there. Maybe it's more relevant, at least from what we could say about it.
Man, my insider information is a bit too insider.
So
It's like, yeah,
what can you say publicly about the
what can I
Lazada?
say?
Uh, it's Alibaba is I don't know what they think that there's going to be a better market timing for this, or they don't need the capital. Is that what it's signaling? Or
Okay,
they do
okay,
need the
let's
capital? Is that
let's
what
look
it's
at the
signaling?
politically correct version to say on this. All right,
Yeah,
I'm going to cap it
yeah,
to a couple of minutes so that we don't get too long. We cover your different topics. So Lazada potential IPO. I think the understanding here is that SE as a stock performed so well during 2020 that the
yeah.
idea that investors may want to purchase a stock that is outside of China that has some Chinese control, but
Mm,
primarily an exposure outside of China would be very attractive, right? So if you think about Alibaba's position, their stock price has gone below IPO price. Now it's tanking even further, and they need a way to save their stock price, right? So you enter the story um, of Naspers, right? How Naspers owns a huge
yeah,
chunk of Tencent stock, and basically, or Yahoo owning Alibaba stock, and then surviving through it, right? If you're inside Alibaba, you're probably thinking, hey, is there a reverse strategy? Are we at that stage of growth now where we need to pull a Yahoo or pull a Naspers,
mm,
find another company that is doing really well, sell that story, and then make big bucks from it, and it can be
yeah,
30% of our account, and we have some control. And
mm,
so, if you think about it, during the time of the acquisition, there was never really a conversation about an IPO. Possibly in the
yeah.
future, it was pushed around,
Very
but no one
loose.
ever, like suggested it to happen within a certain time period. But then, given their current situation, they were like, okay, what can we do so that we can create some kind of positive equity story? But I think there were so many things that happened together that botched it. We won't get into the full details of it, but at
Yeah,
the end of the day, fundamentals need to be right. Number one.
yeah,
Number two, that's the kind of story you need to build up over some time. I think it leaked before it should have.
mm,
And number three is like you really need to get some kind of positive spin, not just like on the fundamentals, but on the outside of why this thing is sexy, right? And they
Yeah.
actually had a couple of really interesting things. So I don't know if you know this, but like Alibaba's also acquired significant stakes in e-commerce players outside of Southeast Asia. So Daraz in
Interesting.
Pakistan,
Oh yes, yeah,
Paytm in India. They have
correct.
some equity stake in a Turkish company. I forget the name of the company, but like they could have created this really cool. I mean, if I was in the driving seat, I would have tried to create some kind of international story around multiple outside of China
Mm,
plays. Um, and I think that could have been really sexy, like a unified
yeah.
country ex
Well,
China.
that's what
Sorry?
Rocket did, right? That's what Rocket did with like Global Fashion Group.
Correct.
They put all, and they bundled it and they kind of
Correct.
raised the money in it, and it kind of runs itself now, right? So
Exactly. So like the GFG strategy could have worked for Alibaba, as opposed to just Lazada, because that's in a way that's what Shopee did, right? I don't know if you know, but like Shopee's primarily driver of revenues for the first 5 years of the existence was Taiwan, right? Which
yeah,
isn't in Southeast Asia, and yet they would
correct,
be compared neck to neck against Lazada in those days, right?
correct. Yeah.
Um, so Greater Southeast Asia is what they called it. Like there was so many different ways to do this. I don't think it was fully thought through, and I think it came out too early, and then that kind of like killed chances. I don't think it's completely killed chances. I think it gives them time to at least work on it.
Correct.
But honestly, they need to invest more in getting this thing to grow.
Well, that's what Shopee did really well before this whole, war, macro crashes, people talking about inflation. Like they've raised at the right time with the right story, which I think maybe Lazada was a little bit too slow on. Which, I mean, if you want, you could say a corollary to GoTo as well. Their timing is really not too good. Do you have any thoughts on the GoTo IPO or?
I think, man, with Go2, um, honestly, I'm a bit like confused why they're getting so much of a beating, right? Like
This is what we were looking for last week when you weren't there. We're like, who has the other side of the story?
I I mean, look, how many amazing Indonesian startups can you invest in as a foreign investor right now? Right?
Okay, yeah.
There's
So
not very many,
yeah,
right?
if you want
And
exposure to Indonesia, yeah,
correct. So you've got this massive domestic, GDP growth, this demographic dividend that people want to invest in, and you don't have a lot of stories to invest in. Granted, every big, e-com IPO we've seen, e-com slash logistics IPO over the last year, 2 years has kind of flopped, right? Bukalapak did terrible. Grab is trading at 1/4 of the IPO price, So, but then the question is like, would they have, like, like would they have lessons to learn from this, right? And
yeah.
and I forget who said this, but I think it was like the GC or corporate secretary of GoTo, who's like, we've been humbled by the response from institutional investors, right? I remember reading that and I'm like, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing when you've been
Yeah.
humbled by something? Like, does that mean there's been so much response that you don't know what to do with it, or does that mean like these investors have been giving you a spanking? I don't know, but I think
Yeah, yeah,
so. I don't think there's such a thing as a bad deal. I only think there's such a thing as a bad price, right? I learned this.
yeah.
I learned this in my first ever M&A negotiation, and I think I carry this truth to true, right? Like, at the end of the day, do people want to invest in an Indonesian opportunity? Yes. Do people believe in the go-to story? I think the story is pretty good, right? You've got Gojek, you've got Tokopedia. You're putting these things together. There's a tech piece. There's a financial piece. There's the Indonesian story.
Yeah.
Now the question is the pricing right? And this is the part we don't know, right? Like, they were
Yeah.
saying 1.1 B of a raise. What was the price? The market
The
cap that they,
valuation,
yeah,
30 billion.
30 B, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So 30 B valuation. This is the part that's really tricky, right? Because if you look at their numbers, a little bit better than Grab, right?
Yeah.
Uh, a little bit better than Grab, but still, negative PE stories have been doing terrible, right? Look at Shopee stock and how it's getting a beating, Grab's getting a beating.
Yeah.
Um, so I think long term, great plan, but I think the IPO itself might be a bit tricky. They'll probably go through a similar phase of what Grab is going through, but I think Honestly, though, with all these IPOs in the last 18 months, there's been very few success stories. Like
Yeah.
I was looking at Payoneer yesterday. Payoneer's story was incredible. I remember getting into the IPO thinking like, fuck yeah, this stock is going to like perform, and then like
Yeah.
18 months later, it's dipped to like 50% of IPO price,
Yeah.
and it's like really
So,
like yeah, same
no,
thing.
go ahead. Well, the U.S. also had a lot of disappointing IPOs at the end of last year, right? So 2021, they saw a whole slew of IPOs that I don't know. It almost feels like it's the result of too much financial engineering. Like all these people who got in early just need to get liquid, right? They need to raise their next funds, and that's what's kind of pushing it. Macro environment, people getting more risk coming off, I guess. So, but it's an interesting perspective. Like the only counter narrative, only the counter, the devil's advocate to what you're saying is they just will not be able to pull it together, at least for Grab. I don't know like how much of a machine e-commerce Tokopedia is in Indonesia. I don't know the company that well, but Grab is like, what is the Garena to Shopee for Grab, right? So are they going to burn through their balance sheet, or can they make something stick, or do they just have to accept a more reasonable valuation? And that's going to be like a
Bro,
Groupon that gets
you
stuck,
gotta
right?
think. You gotta think long term. You gotta think long term. Like these stories are nice for right now, right? We can all piss on Grab and Go to in a 6 month period. But ask me this: do I want to be holding Grab and Go to stock 10 years from now? The answer for me is fuck yes,
Yeah,
right? Right? Like yes, they'll take a beating in this. Like which stock? Remember when Tesla was taking a beating,
yeah,
right? Remember when Netflix was taking a beating, right? Remember when Google was taking a beating for like a couple of quarters? Like all stocks are going to take a beating. You just got to hold through the bad quarters. And you know what? Like
yeah,
if I mean, if it was me, buy these. Like okay, there's some stocks, and I got to run soon, but like I'm just like, so quick cover on Chinese stocks. Chinese stocks, I don't know if you should touch them, right? Because there's like
yeah,
deep rooted fundamental regulations. They could get
yeah,
delisted. Like so, definitely not a buy for me right now, right? I'm still
yeah,
holding a lot of them, but I'm
yeah. Of
holding
course.
with almost like, hopefully, they'll
Yeah,
go up,
maybe you'll come
but
back.
maybe I'll come back. But worst case, I might lose the
Yeah,
stuff, right? But
yeah.
these Indonesian stocks, the Southeast Asian growth story. Do you believe in the growth story? Yes. Do you believe there are other companies that are better in Southeast Asia right now to buy that have a similar kind of growth trajectory or story? No, right? Do you
Yeah.
believe in the management teams of these companies? Are they attracting smart talent? Is the talent able to do really good stuff over time? I personally know a ton of people working at both these companies, and they're incredible human beings who know what they're doing. They're smart, they're driven, they're ambitious. So, like, look at it from a very fundamentals perspective. I'm not talking about fundamentals like financial fundamentals,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
saying like if you're holding something for the next 10, 20 years, right? I mean, we're in our 30s, right? Do I want to
Yeah.
be holding Grab stock when I'm in my 50s? Yeah.